Well, I know suffering. I've grown up in Kansas City, and I've been a Royals fan my whole life. I know suffering. I've seen the team they put on the field this year. I've seen the plans to move the ballpark from the Truman Sports Complex to somewhere else. I know what it is to suffer. I have gone to wash my car, and on the way home, that 20% chance of rain has come true. I know suffering. I have watched an online show that didn't allow me to skip the ads. I know suffering. I have been asked to go get ice cream and ended up at a frozen yogurt shop. I know suffering. Did I mention I'm a Royals fan? It seems like the suffering will never end. If we haven't met before, my name's Ryan. I'm one of the pastors here at the Summit, and it's a privilege to see you today and to have an opportunity to share from the Scriptures with you. Today, we're going to talk about something that applies to everyone across the board. If you walked in with a deep, abiding faith and you've been following Jesus for a long time, this message applies to you. If you walked in and you aren't sure if you even believe in God, I believe strongly that today's message has something incredible for you as well, as we think about what it looks like to endure suffering. Let me catch you up to where we are in the first 3 weeks of this series. In week 1, we handed you a journal. And we told you could take that journal and you could write scripture along with us by copying a few verses each day. And at the end, you'd have your own copy of 1 Peter in your hands. And I've heard some incredible stories from some of you about your own practices of writing scripture and what's that looked like and what it's meant to you as we've gone through that process together. And we got you off to a start by providing you with 1 Peter chapter 1 written out by hand. And yes, people complained that it was illegible, and yes, it was my handwriting. So I apologize for that. But I do hope that along the way that you have written some in your own handwriting that you can read as well. The message in part 1 was a message about redemption. And the challenge was to accept the redemption that Jesus offers. And we painted a picture for you. A picture's kind of like this. A study shows that the average person has $187 of unused gift cards in their possession. And some of you are just astonished that that could possibly be true because gift cards burn a hole in your pocket, especially Xbox gift cards, right? You can't keep those. You just have to spend that money. But in total, there is $23 billion of unspent money in our pockets when we have gift cards. And what do we know about gift cards? Gift cards don't mean anything until we accept the redemption that they can offer. And so the challenge that week was to accept the redemption that Jesus offers, to live into the salvation, the grace that Jesus offers us. In week 2, we got to 1 Peter chapter 2, and we talked about the reality that following Jesus means living differently. And we talked about the concept of sin. I know, so fun, right? I got sin and then suffering kind of back to back. In sin, we talked about the idea of fighting against the sin that we find in our own lives. And we painted a picture of what that could look like, about thinking about the right things, because when we think about the right things, our life moves in the right direction. You may remember the story about Bob Ross, who went from being a drill instructor to the joy of painting Bob Ross on PBS. And it's all about meeting the expectations that are placed on you based on the role that you find yourself in. And when you call yourself a Christian, there are certain expectations that people have of you. And the question that we must wrestle with is, are we living into that and becoming that in the way that we should? Last week in part 3, Pastor Chris was here, and he brought out a chainsaw, which was a very manly thing to do. And he held his chainsaw, and he reminded us of the plight of a wildfire firefighter. And he showed us the tools that they used, but also reminded us they sometimes find themselves in a predicament, that the tools that they brought with them can actually hold them back. And so when the fire closes in, that sometimes the order is to drop the chainsaw and run because you can't be hindered by anything you hold on to. And we were reminded that sometimes we have a really hard time of letting go what we brought, whether it's unforgiveness or bitterness or envy or whatever that might be. And Chris challenged us not to be a what goes around comes around type person, but instead to refuse to offer people retaliation when they do something against you. And really what we've arrived at is this point where Peter is writing to us, sharing with us what this type of life gets you. When you are redeemed, when you are fighting against sin, when you are saying no to retaliating against people and choosing to live in a way that honors and respects them at every turn, what do you end up with? You end up with the promise of suffering. But not only that, you end up with some keys on how to overcome or survive that suffering. Because for each one of us, we're going to endure suffering in our lives in some way. And to be clear, the Royals losing, although it feels like suffering, is not, because it will be over after today. We will move on to what's next. See, real suffering is lasting pain. It's that thing in your life that you can't just shake off and move on from. And for some, it's the crushing pain of losing someone you've lost. Maybe it's racism or sexism or some other discrimination that you've experienced in your life, or maybe you struggle with chronic pain or some other medical condition. Maybe you have an economic hardship. Whatever that circumstance is that causes you difficulty can lead you to struggle and take you to a place of suffering. So the question today is not necessarily will I suffer or how I suffer. The question for us today is how will I deal with my suffering? Because the way that we deal with our suffering is really important because of this truth. How you respond to suffering demonstrates where you place your trust. How you respond when things get hard, tell people what's really important to you in your life. Are you a do-it-yourself, solve-it-yourself type person? You don't need your faith in God in those moments. Or are you someone who just kind of sits back and hopes that somebody else solves the problem for you? Today, I'm going to invite you into the story. I'm going to invite you to consider what it might look like to reframe your suffering, to think differently about your suffering. And today, I want to give you 3 keys to survive your suffering. We're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 12. And the first point I want to make today is this. In order to survive your suffering, number 1, seek wise counsel. Seek wise counsel. Verse 12. Dear friends, we're going to pause real quick. And some of you are like, you've already talked about this. You talked about this in week 2. And some of you weren't here in week 2. And so I just want to catch you up. This is an important place for us to begin. Dear friends. You may remember that the Greek word that's being used here is the word agapetos, which means, or it has the root word of agape, and agape means love, right? I mean, I see you guys doing the math in your head. You're like, yeah, Greek, I got this. No problem. And so this word agapetos, being translated as friends, actually does a little bit of an injustice to the strength that this word is actually bringing. This word actually means something closer to beloved or dear one or favorite. It's saying, hey, listen, I care about you so much. I love you deeply. And it's necessary to understand that because of what follows, because what follows gets a little bit difficult. We keep reading. Do not be surprised. We're going to skip that phrase in the middle there. We'll come back to it in a second. As though something strange were happening to you. Do not be surprised as though something strange were happening to you. And this is crucial. Because sometimes I think that we're convinced that when we give our life to Jesus, that life is going to be easier. And that's not actually true. Life is going to be better, but life is not necessarily going to be easier because putting your faith and your trust in Jesus is not a suffering avoidance strategy. It's actually a suffering survival strategy. Because somewhere along the way, you see a glimmer of hope that you can grab a hold of when something happens in your life that's unfavorable or unplanned or unpredicted. And when we have that to grab a hold of, it allows our faith in Jesus to propel us forward with a measure of hope that people who don't believe simply cannot have. And so it makes me wonder. This is a hard word, right? It's saying beloved, best friends, favorites. Don't be surprised when things get hard. We're like, well, how hard can it possibly be? And this is where that middle phrase comes in. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you. Now, when I hear that, I can think of all kinds of things that could be, right? It could be the Royals, and it could be the frozen yogurt, and it could be the ads, right? It could be all of those things, but a first century Christian hearing that phrase would have thought something totally different. Their context is different. Their understanding is different. And when they heard the word fiery ordeal, I think there are two things that would have immediately jumped to mind for them. Number one, they would have thought of the way that Christians are being treated throughout the world. Now remember, this book is written to a group of Christians that are scattered throughout what is modern-day Turkey. They've sort of defected. They're called the diaspora. They're doing their own thing. They're living in small pockets of community, and they're seeing what's happening to other Christians. Well, what is that? Well, here's what the Roman historian Tacitus writes. Covered with the skins of beasts, the Christians were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. This method of torture was known as the Roman candle. Far different from the ones we buy and shoot on the 4th of July, right? This Roman candle was a Christian, someone who had professed their hope and their faith and their allegiance to Jesus and not to Nero. And they were taken and they were covered in fuel and they were lit on fire and tied to stakes in Nero's garden to illuminate his garden during his parties. They were burned alive. This is a fiery ordeal. This is not something to joke about. This is not something to take lightly. When they read about the suffering they're going to endure, it strikes a chord deep within them. But there's a second thing I think that might pop up too. Now, it doesn't necessarily jump to the surface for someone like me and you because we don't have the same life experiences. We don't know the Old Testament the same way that these folks probably would have, and it's found in Psalm 66. Oh God, you have purified us like silver. Now, I'm not up to date on all of my silver purification techniques, but I did read some folks who are, and essentially it goes like this. The silver is subjected to heat. It is melted, and the dross or the impurities rise to the top. You scrape them off, and you allow it to cool down and come to temperature again. And then you heat it up again, and you allow the impurities to rise to the top and cool off, and you do that time and time again. And every time it is subjected to heat, the impurities are removed and it becomes more and more pure. It becomes closer and closer to the approximation of what it is that God wanted it to be, free of impurities and contamination. It's the best version of itself. I love hearing stories about how this happens. I saw one recently. This is the story of Jamie Siminoff. He arrived on the Shark Tank set, and he was seeking $700,000 for a 10% stake in his company. His company was called Doorbot. It was a doorbell that when you pushed the button, it allowed you to see the person on video. And the Sharks weren't really sure about it. They peppered him with questions. They asked him about the security of it and if people would actually want one of those things. And ultimately, they all had the opportunity to pay the money, and none of them did. Siminoff had been in the refiner's fire. The heat was coming. The impurities were being burned away because they weren't wowed. They weren't convinced. They didn't think his product had merit. They said they didn't think it would ever make money. But Jamie Siminoff believed in himself. He believed that what he set out to do could be done, and he kept on fighting. And so he changed the name of his company from Doorbot to Ring, and he sold that company to Amazon for over $800 million. It's often on the other side of rejection that we find ourselves better. The destination is worth the journey. This is a reflection of the true gospel of Jesus. The words of Jesus, John chapter 16, verse 33. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. And if you walked in this place today and you're not sure about the things of faith, I'm here to tell you that suffering will find you. And I strongly believe that the hope that Jesus provides, the fact that Jesus says trouble is coming and I have defeated it, is a promise worth testing out. Saying yes to what he might offer in a way that allows you to walk with a measure of hope, because this is the Christian life. To embrace the suffering and difficulties, knowing that there's hope on the other side. Suffering becomes not a reason to despair, but instead a reason to hope and a place to look for God's blessings in our own lives. So how do we do this? We seek the input and insight of other people. It means that we seek wise counsel. Why does it matter who we surround ourselves with? Why is it good to allow people who tell us what we need to hear and not what we want to hear around us? Because this is true. How you respond to suffering demonstrates where you place your trust. Key number 1 to surviving your suffering is seek wise counsel. Key number 2, how to survive your suffering? Steer your emotions to God's truth. We pick back up in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 13. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Now, take note of all the times that there's a feeling expressed in this verse. Rejoice, overjoyed, insulted, blessed. Those are all ways for us to feel. And there are extremes to our feelings, right? I mean, there are the feelings that get us in trouble. The feelings that tell us negative, harmful things, or maybe even feelings that tell us things that are overly positive and we need to maybe have a level of reality in the midst of them. And then there are the feelings that are super helpful. And when are they helpful? They're helpful when we subject them to the truth of God. And my feelings tell me anything that's contrary to the Word of God, my feeling is wrong. And the truth of God's Word is right. This is the principle of the refiner's fire at work. It's exhibiting extreme trust in God. Embracing suffering as an opportunity to be more like Jesus requires that we exhibit strength and maturity. And this whole reality is something you can file under if you know you know. If you've gone through suffering, you've put your faith and your trust in God, on the other side you can look back and say, I did and I'm better for it. And if you never have, maybe you can't see that truth today. I sometimes stop at the gas station down on 3rd Street, and people are coming in from Longview Community Center, and sometimes I see people with a shirt that says, no pain, no gain. You can file that under, I don't understand, because that's not going to be my thing, right? But when it is, you know. And when it is, you can tell. We should never be surprised that we face suffering because this world is broken and it's fallen, and suffering will find us. There are pastors who would tell you that if you just exhibit a little bit of faith, you would be healed. If you just exhibit a little bit of faith, your relationship would be fixed. If you just exhibit a little bit of faith, that financial situation that you have in your life would resolve. And that's called the prosperity gospel, and it's not true. Exhibiting more faith is putting our faith in Jesus and trusting Him with the outcomes in our life, not expecting Him because of our faith to do what we want Him to do. Suffering is unavoidable, regardless of your faith story. But when you walk with Jesus and you seek counsel from people who are wise and say true things into your life, it can propel you to a next level in your faith journey. I shared this quote with you in week 2, so 2 weeks ago, and it's still true 2 weeks later, so I want to share it with you again. It's from Rochelle, and he writes this in his book. Our lives are always moving in the direction of our strongest thoughts. I can tell you this is true today because of what happened to me last night. So last night was Lee Summit West homecoming, Lee Summit North also, I believe, and so we went to take pictures for homecoming. And I didn't know this until recently, but you can't take pictures anywhere at someone's house or something. You have to go somewhere fancy. And so we went to Nelson Atkins. And Rebecca and I had this plan, right? We were going to go and we were going to take pictures, and then we were going to go to dinner. And so we did the math, right? It's like, okay, so we're arriving at this time, and it's going to take this long, and we can make it to our dinner reservation. And so what we found is people didn't arrive at this time, and it took longer than we thought, and we missed our dinner reservation. And here's the problem. Our dinner reservation was at Barrio, which is fantastic Mexican food. So since I woke up this morning, no lie, all I've thought about was eating Mexican food. In fact, I was drinking coffee and I just pretended it was a taco. And it made everything so much better today. But I can tell you that this reality is true. Why? Because when I leave this place, you know where I'm going? To eat Mexican food. Because what I think about, I do. And it's a silly example, right? But it's so true. In every area of our lives, when we point ourselves towards something true and worthwhile, it helps us to get where we want to go. Why does that matter? Because how you respond to suffering demonstrates where you place your trust. When we become obsessed with our suffering, allow it to become our whole personality or identity, when we find ourselves wallowing in loathe and self-pity, it leads us down a trail that we don't want to be headed down. Instead, we view suffering as an opportunity to see God's blessings in our lives. So, how do you survive suffering? 3 keys. Number 1, seek wise counsel. Number 2, steer your emotions to God's truth. And number 3, sow blessings into others. Verse 19. This is the culmination. Peter said everything he wants to say, and then he says this: so then, in light of everything you've heard, in light of the truth that I've just shared with you, with all the things on your mind, so then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. When we suffer as Christ suffered, when we suffer righteously, we should continue to do good. There's a subtle connection here that I think is incredibly important. And that connection is this: faith leads to obedience. When we exhibit our faith in God, when we put our trust and our allegiance in Him, it leads us to do the things that He wants us to do. Faith leads to obedience. Here's how James, the brother of Jesus, says it in James chapter 2. Just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. Our faith, even in suffering, propels us to do good for other people. You don't need to shy away from suffering. You don't need to run away from suffering. You can embrace suffering as an opportunity to bless other people. In the face of suffering, I encourage others. I pray for others. I meet the needs of others. What are you doing? Continuing to do good. As this was coming together and this thought was on my mind, there was an example that just popped in my head that I just wanted to share with you today. On the screen behind me is a picture of Shar Fisher and her husband, Don. Shar was diagnosed with cancer a number of years ago, and in the midst of her cancer diagnosis, she immediately recognized the incredible group of people she had around her. She had a great family, a great church family. She had an incredible medical team, and all of that sustained her throughout her cancer treatments. But in her words, the thing that was a lifesaver to her was the opportunity to bless others by serving them. As Shar went through her chemotherapy treatments, she did projects for the church. We sent 2,000 sleeves that go on coffee cups to her house, along with a little stamp and a stamp pad. And her husband, Don, sat on the living room floor and stamped them so that we would have branded coffee sleeves for our Christmas Eve services that she was not going even to be able to attend. After that, we sent a box to her house almost every week full of supplies that they would be using in kids' ministry. And so she would string things and staple things and glue things and punch holes in things and assemble things and make sure everything was just right so that box could be delivered back to our kids' ministry team. They would have everything they needed in their classrooms to teach the kids about Jesus on a Sunday that she wasn't even going to be here. Shar's desire to be a blessing to others in the midst of her suffering made an impact that went far beyond that, because even now we have a team that meets once a month to make preparations for various ministry areas, to do things to help them be ready. They're called the Project Prep Crew. We're creative, I know. And eventually Shar was able to ring the bell as she concluded her cancer treatments. But even more than that, she's made a lasting impact on the lives of kids and adults that she'll never even know, because she chose to bless people during her time of suffering. Why does that matter? Because how you respond to suffering demonstrates where you place your trust. The 3 keys to surviving suffering: seek wise counsel, steer your emotions to God's truth and sow blessing in the lives of others. You know, it was September 13th of this year that the Royals were officially eliminated from contention for the playoffs. It's far from 30 years, but it has been true for the last 6 years, and it feels like, oh, I hope this is not the way we're headed. To love the Royals is to know suffering. And I imagine if we went around the room, each one of you would have something that you could share that's a difficulty in your life. As I look around, I see folks who have recently lost loved ones, folks who are dealing with illnesses for their children, people who are helping their spouse navigate a dementia diagnosis. There are hard things in our lives that we deal with on a regular basis. And as difficult as those things can make the day-to-day, they don't have to define us. They don't have to defeat us. And don't get me wrong, you can let your suffering consume you, but you don't have to. You can entrust your suffering to a God who knows you, who loves you, and who wants the very best for you. And when you see your suffering as something to be expected, and as an opportunity to exercise your faith, it changes everything. Because your perspective shifts. And it may not happen today. It may not happen before the Chiefs play tonight. It may not happen by morning time, but I sure hope by this time tomorrow that you'll have at least considered the reality that the suffering that you're experiencing in your life is an opportunity to hand it over to God, to give Him control in your life, and to see His goodness in the midst of life's difficulties.